School and staff for giving me this opportunity to be here. It's great. It's a great place to be. I've always respected Vermont Law School a great deal and all the wonderful work that you do. Before I get started into the talk itself, I want to clarify a term. I think most of you may know this, but some of you may not. So we're talking today about climate change, but there are terms of art in climate change. And the two most prominent, and the one that I think it's important to understand the distinction, is between climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. The term of art is used in policy wonks and professors and all sorts of climate people is that mitigation is the things we undertake to lessen or reduce how much greenhouse gas we are putting into the atmosphere, or we are figuring out ways to uptake greenhouse gases, like in biological sequestration. So it is trying to minimize the problem now or in the future. Climate change adaptation, on the other hand, is what we're going to do to deal with a climate that has already changed and will continue to change. We know that no matter what we do, if we stop putting any more greenhouse gases into the air right now, it is quite likely that the average temperature of the Earth would continue to rise, and the effects associated with that, such as changes in precipitation, changes in sea level, changes in habitat, changes in disease vectors, would all continue. So given that our world is changing, we have to think about how we're going to adapt to those changes. And that's the focus of what I want to talk to you about today. So I want to start by asking you, what do all of these things have in common? Obamacare, that's Kathleen Sebelius. There she is again. The Stafford Act, which deals with disaster relief and emergency assistance. The Endangered Species Act, and the IRS tax code, everybody's favorite. What they all have in common is that they all are going to need to change and respond sometime in the future to a world made different by climate change. Notice only one of these is what we would call a natural resource law. The other three are broader. And in fact, that's the main point of what I want to discuss today. That climate change and adapting to climate change will have to occur across a broad swath of society, not just in natural resources. So I want to suggest that we need to have policy responses in climate change for all of society, and that looking or focusing on law as a way to do that, as a framework for doing that, may be a good way to undertake this work. And then at the end, I want to propose a method for doing that. A systemic way to approach law in the face of climate change. So let me just give you a quick overview of what we have in climate change and how it relates, climate change adaptation, and how it relates to what I want to speak about. We are starting to see in scholarship, both in the legal realm and in the policy realm, emerging strands of adaptation. That theories about how we should adapt and how things can change. And in fact, we're starting to see those things take effect. We have policies at many different levels of government. We have policies in the private sector, all starting to focus on how we're going to change in respect to the climate. Primarily, however, this has focused mostly on natural resources. Now, that kind of makes sense because when we think about the climate, we think about its effect on natural resources. And that is very important, and it's been a big issue in how we can do that. But I'm going to suggest that it goes beyond that, and I'm going to explain why. In fact, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has specifically stated that when we consider climate change adaptation, we have to look beyond the natural resource world to changes in human systems. Unless we can essentially replicate or replace our current natural systems identically, then we are going to have to look beyond adapting in the natural world alone, because our entire human society and our entire human interaction depends upon the workings of the natural environment and the natural resource system. So though scholarship today and focus in adaptation has been just on natural resources, I say it needs to go further than that. But what has it focused on? Mostly, it's been a systemic focus in the natural resource area. There's been a lot of research about scale. What's the best level to address climate change that we should do to adapt to it? Should we do it at the local level, at the international level, the national level? And there have been myriad approaches that several scholars have put forward. And I will talk about these as we go forward to do that. And I'm going to take that and find commonalities in these approaches, and that gives me the suggestion for a comprehensive legal approach to adaptation. In other words, a way to adapt legal regimes. So before I go into this prior scholarship and prior way of looking at climate change adaptation, I want us to consider why law? Why are we looking at this, or why do I want to look at this through the lens of our legal system? Well, first, it replies to what I call the environmental first responder issue. It's no surprise that most of the scholarship on climate change adaptation has been in the natural resource field, primarily because that's the people, those are the people that have first felt the impacts of climate change and have first thought about climate change. In fact, if you go into the world of policy generally, almost everyone defers to the environmental resource person when the question of climate change comes up, right? That's an environmental issue. So we need to talk to the environmentalists and the environmental professors and the environmental policymakers, et cetera, et cetera. And so they have been the focus of all of the thinking and working about climate change adaptation. But because they and me, we're all primarily focused and we are educated in the environmental sciences and resource systems, we tend to limit what we talk about to the environmental resource systems. And so what I want to do is break out of that. I want us to move just out of the natural resource centric way and look at this beyond that. Law is what I would call systemic. It's systemic and interlinked. And as such, it provides its own subject matter expertise. We know people talk about tax law and health law and social security law, natural resources law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know about all of these, but someone does. And in each of these cases, we have scholars and folks who are experts and focus in a substantive area of law. Now, when I say law is systemic and interlinked, I'm really referring to our historical way of looking at the law, especially for the more recent, the current law students. You'll probably remember this. Under the classical theory of common law, the courts apply what they call a, quote, complete, coherent, and formal body of law that police the boundaries of legislative authority and define the ground rules for interaction among private individuals through contracts, torts, and property. So we have, for over a century and a half in the Anglo-American system, had a conception of law as a fully interlinked system, arising primarily from the common law, but also respecting the input from legislatures and statutes and how they interact with that. And therefore, when we talk and think about law, we have to think about how it works together. As some have said, law is like an organism. It must be evolved from prior organisms, and changes in focus are added onto and integrated with what already exists. This is evolutionary. It protects against the accidental loss of prior ideas and tools. And it doesn't mean that we don't need to wholesale change the law sometimes or reconsider what we're doing. And in fact, some people have called for, we need a whole new economic system, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is, we exist in this framework of law, and therefore we need to work from that framework of law. Law governs our entire society. There's not one part of it that is not touched by law and legal interaction. Law then can be seen as a scaffolding, and we can hang adaptation on this. Law deals with complexity and scale without introducing other perturbances. What I mean by that is this. Imagine if you were to decide you knew the best way that the world should be organized, and you were in natural resources, and you decided you would help people adapt to changes in natural resources. Well, if that's all you're thinking about, you may be pulling or tearing strands from other areas of law without even having that knowledge. But current laws, as they are, do exist and interact, and they work and give back and forth to each other. Sometimes this is a bad thing, and sometimes this is a good thing. We often hear in the world, gosh, we have a silo approach to laws in the world. We only think about environmental pollution over here, we think about public health over there, we think about healthcare over here, we think about insurance over there, and gosh, we need to get beyond this silo way of thinking. We're siloed in our endangered species, or we're siloed in our National Environmental Policy Act, or we're siloed in hazardous waste law, or tax law, or wherever we are. And there is something to be said for trying to get out of your silo and looking at the other areas to which your silo is connected. But whether you get out of your silo or not, or anybody else gets out of their silo or not, the silos are connected. Our legal system is comprehensive. It's evolutionary, it's evolved, and our courts spend most of their time when they deal with statutes trying to apply and figure out how all of these statutes work together simultaneously when they overlap and apply to the same subject matter. That's the way our legal system exists. And therefore, we need to both understand that we have this as a silo framework, but that we also are connected and it's comprehensive. Last, I just want to say that I am arguing this at this point as an approach for the United States. And the reason I'm not saying it shouldn't necessarily apply worldwide is because of how I think law can change with respect to climate change adaptation. And I'm going to propose and talk about the need to do this through democratic legislation. And that system doesn't exist in all the world. In fact, we could argue that it doesn't exist in our own country, particularly right now. And I want to respond to that issue at one point. But at least theoretically, in a pluralistic representative government, this is the way that laws are made. So this would apply in that system, not necessarily in a system that was a top-down oligarchy or dictatorship kind of system. All right, so I've just tried to explain to you why I think we need to focus on law as doing climate change adaptation. So what else is out there? What can we glean when we start to bring these ideas to law and climate change adaptation? If you look at past work, you're going to see that there's a focus on a few different things, and some good principles come from this. First is the issue of funding and responsibility. Whenever you look at discussions of climate change adaptation, invariably you come to the question of who should pay for that adaptation, right? If you're going to have to move native Alaskan villages away from coastal areas in Alaska, which essentially all of them, except Barrow, which is quite large, and Kotzebue, will have to be moved, over 100 of them, who pays for that? Well, and that's intertwined with the question of who's responsible for it. Who should pay for it, right? Who caused this? Who's caused the harm that are hurting these people? Of course, you can expand that. Who's responsible for helping reconceptualize how people live and work and survive in Bangladesh, where we are expecting 50 million climate change refugees? Who does that? So when we look at all of our discussion about climate change and adapting, we have to think about who pays for it and who's responsible for it. The next thing we learn is that when we talk about climate change and climate change adaptation, we have to deal with dynamism and complexity. That is that we are in a world that is different from how most of us have conceptualized the world before. Most of us, most of the world, most legal scholars, most environmental scholars, come from a position that we live in a relatively static environment. Things can change up and down a little bit here and there, but that there's some sort of natural good background that we want to get to. Some natural background that's somewhat devoid of human interference, and that is kind of the ideal situation, the Eden, if you will. But that is not a truism in a climate change altered world. The world is changing, and it is going to continue to change. And we don't know how it's going to continue to change. So everything we do when we think about adaptation has to think about the fact that we're not just trying to get back to a particular place, but that we are responding to something that is itself changing. And because of that, partly, and partly for the fact that we're talking about the entire world, it's incredibly complex, or it can be incredibly complex, right? You can talk about entirely integrated ecological and social systems. And hopefully we can think today of some ideas and think about it broadly, but when you get into the weeds, it can be incredibly complex. So that's very important to think about when we're going forward. The other thing that comes up is the idea of participation. That is that when we think about changing the world or responding to a changing world, who gets to do that, right? Who gets to make the decision on who funds it and who's responsible, and who gets to decide what the appropriate response is going to be? We don't have a benevolent dictator. We do have cadres of scientists. In fact, I don't know if any of you saw this just today. A working group was formed in the U.S. to address at a very high level whether or not we should be engaged in geoengineering. That's climate change mitigation to reverse things. Very critical issue, but very fraught with many complexities and many potential downsides. Who appointed them? Well, they sort of appointed themselves, but they sort of have the approval of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which theoretically represents all the countries participating in this, and they sort of have the approval of the U.S. government, which theoretically represents what we have talked about, and they sort of have the approval of the people that formed the convention, or want to form a convention on geoengineering that met in Japan a couple of years ago. So the idea is that you can't just let anybody make a decision, that these decisions have to come and be made by those who will be impacted and affected. So however we respond to climate change adaptation, we need to make sure that all of those affected stakeholders and persons have a say in how we respond. So from all of these these four ideas, we've seen some responses that some people have proposed, again, primarily in the natural resources field. One of these responses, and one that most of you, more of you may be familiar with, is the concept of resiliency. This is a great new word that we use all the time now, resilient, resilient, resilient. We need to add resiliency to our coasts, our species, and you could say our laws. Our laws need to be more resilient. They need to be able to weather the changes and the dynamism of the world that's moving forward. Related to that is the proposal to use adaptive management for agencies. Adaptive management is a term of art. In theory, it means a resource agency can get information from the way they're managing their resources, and they can figure out that they're doing it wrong and use that information to respond and do a better job. I say theoretically because it doesn't always work that way. But some folks have proposed taking that and putting it out for every agency in every part of government. We get an almost consistent agreement that the approach should go bottom up. The idea is that we need to have government response at the lowest level where it can possibly make a difference. Why? Because that fosters the participation that we talked about earlier and the responsibility. So almost all of the ones that have looked at this, both in the international and domestic context, have said bottom up. Doesn't mean you don't do things at the national or international level, but you have to remember that you've got to look from the base as well. This one is one that I've paraphrased it here, but I think this is very important. And that is, when you're looking at law and law responding to a changed world, it's critical that you remember the original goals of the law in the first place. Before you can alter it or move from it, or just be resilient with it, you need to think of what you're supposed to do. What is the law supposed to do? Why do we have this law? And if we don't focus on original goals, we get to a problem, again, with participation. Imagine, if you will, that you have, and I'll come back to this, the Corps of Engineers, which deals with multiple use mandates and managing water supply in the southeastern United States. And they decide that they want to do something in a particular way because they just think that's better. Maybe keep Nashville from flooding again, like it did 2 years ago, and causing huge economic loss of life. Maybe diverting water more for agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. Well, they may or may not have that authority, and we have to determine, do they have that authority? What were the original goals of this multiple use mandate that was given to them? How far does it go? What are they supposed to do? And that's very important. The other thing that bubbles up in almost all of this research is this idea of no regrets. That with climate change and adapting to climate change, because it's so uncertain, and I don't mean that it's uncertain that the climate is changing. What I mean is it's uncertain how and in what way and how rapidly it's changing. We may not always know the best response. And so if we don't know the best response, it's maybe better to look at it through another frame, that we want to do something good anyway. Maybe we want to just improve public health. Maybe we want to improve water infrastructure. This kind of gets to the idea of the precautionary principle, right? I mean, you know that you need to do something, or you know there's a danger. You do want to respond to that danger, but you want to do so in a way that will lead to fewer regrets in the future, that make it less complicated if you just change a course midstream. This no regrets policy. And in fact, if you could say there's been anything good about climate change to the environmental law movement, it is the fact that it has focused again and again that all of the things that we need to respond to in climate change, like access to clean water, disease vectors, flooding, coastal development, endangered species, we need to have been talking about all along. They need to be reviewed. The systems need to be reviewed. And climate change is now forcing us to do that. So we're going to do it anyway. So let's do it in the right way and do that as we move forward. So, I'm going to go through all these again. There you go. All right. So, given the reviews of what's out there, given what I've seen, given the studies, given these systems, I think any systemic approach to climate change adaptation should be focused on three things. The first is efficiency. Now, sometimes that can sound like or be a dirty word in the environmental movement. I don't mean it that way. What I mean by efficiency is just very simply that if we're going to expend resources doing something, we want to expend the resources in as logical and efficient manner as possible. Why? Because we may need to expend resources more than once. So we may need to husband our resources. Now, that doesn't mean that efficiency is what I think efficiency is, or what my values think it is. It means whatever values you choose, you want to do it to maximize those values. And those values could include participation of the public, those values could include protecting low-income persons, those values could include many things. But whatever values you choose, they need to be efficient. And this is just kind of a sort of an overall global way of looking at interventions in law generally. Secondly, we need to keep in mind environmental justice and distributive problems and distributive impacts. This goes back to who caused climate change and who's responsible for paying for it. I mean, we're no stranger to this in environmental law. We know that environmental impacts tend to fall in ways that are not fair, whether through actions that are intentional or unintentional. But what is true about environmental law generally is true on a much larger scale for climate change. The impacts of climate change already being felt are felt hardest around the world on the poorest, without question. If we survive climate change, it will be the developed and wealthier countries that will survive the most easily, with less loss of life. In our own country, those that have been most impacted by climate change are the poor. Look at the difference between Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina. So because of the primary idea that we have to keep in mind responsibility, who caused this, we have to make sure that we keep in mind environmental justice and distribution. Similarly, if we just go willy-nilly and let governments all over the place start responding with different climate change adaptation, they may have unintended effects on other communities. So we have to keep that in mind too, right? The argument for a top-down approach to climate change adaptation is that it avoids these transboundary problems. It avoids, the city of Keene, New Jersey, putting up sand barriers which cause more flooding in the next town down, right? So sometimes you have to go local up, but you have to have somebody at the top saying, we've got to avoid this distributed problems as well, and that requires a large, higher rate person. And last but not least, we have to keep in mind the original goals. And we have to have a process for examining those goals. Now, I put a quote up from Matthew Zinn, writing about climate change adaptation, as he puts it, ecological mandarins would have extreme difficulty in making trade-offs and adaptation choices. And this is where I think what I say may be most unpopular among environmental folks. When we think about responding to climate change and climate change adaptation, particularly resources, we think we respond in the way that most protects the environment. That's great. But what if protecting the environment was not the only goal? What if there are other goals? We tend to focus on the environment because that's what we understand and what we do. But do we have the right to tell the entire world, especially when we start moving out of the natural resource scale into everything, do we have the right to say this is the way the world ought to be? I mean, I think I'm pretty smart. I like to think I know how the world ought to be, but I'm just one person. And this means that we have to be able to make these decisions in a participatory manner. So this, in fact, calls into question resiliency concepts and adaptive management. How and why? Well, we have arguments out there now that says just make our laws more resilient. What does that do? That makes the ability to make a decision move down from the person that makes the law to the person that administers the law. If the law itself is more resilient, it can bounce more. There's more leeway. You can do more to the left, you can do more to the right, you can do more to the up, you can do more to the down. And somebody gets to make that decision. The administrator of the law makes that decision. Sometimes that's appropriate. I would argue sometimes it's not. In fact, I think some of the best work that's been done in climate change adaptation has come from the Environmental Law Institute working internationally. And they have emphasized again and again that when you talk about resiliency, you have to be talking about resiliency in what? Some decisions, yes, to use the red or the blue marble, you make that at this, administrative stage. But deciding who lives and who dies, that should not be made by administrators. It's not fair to them, and it doesn't take into account who we're responding to. Adaptive management, besides, as I said earlier, not working, can deal with the same issues. It requires the administrator to make and balance all of the questions and make a final decision on how the world works. I actually think, the Corps of Engineers sometimes does a good job given all the difficult pressures it faces. But they didn't want to make the decision about who lived and died and who lost farmland in Middle Tennessee in 2011, and I'm not sure they should have made that decision. That decision needs to be made at a higher level. And so original goals suggest we not only look at them, but we have a process for examining and re-examining those goals that deals with a participatory, democratic system. To me, this suggests a template. I'll just go through it briefly. You first notice what's wrong by a stress point on a law. This becomes obvious. There's a reason the law is not working properly. It's related to climate change. It's noticeable. It means that something has to give or has to be done differently. That leads you to the question, can the law as currently constituted, work under this stress? If not, how can we accomplish as close as possible the goals of this law with keeping in mind the original goals? And do that. If that is impossible, if change is required, the decision-making point is revealed, what's required, and that in turn should be made at the lowest possible legislative level. For example, we've had many thoughtful discussions. Many people have been here and given talks about the problems with the Endangered Species Act and climate change. The Endangered Species Act is not designed to work on a stressor caused by climate change. It is designed to work on a stressor to individual animals or habitats that are caused by humans and can be changed by humans in a short period of time. So if we can no longer protect a species, if the original goal of the Endangered Species Act is impossible with respect to climate change, what do? We could have our managers and DOI and Fish and Wildlife Service try to preserve species. That's the main goal in the confines of the existing laws. And we've seen this. They've proposed new habitat, future habitats that may be different. That's within the constraints of the law. But at some point, we may have to go back and revisit the whole thing. We may have to rethink what our values are in this and what we're going to do about it. And we need to do that in a participatory, democratic manner. I won't leave time for questions, and I'll just show you one quick example of how this works or doesn't work, and a lot of ways it could not work. That is national disaster response. Going back to the Stafford Act now. Under the current law, under the Stafford Act, the FEMA, which is a section of the Department of Homeland Security, believes that it must rebuild in current locations. Any funding reapplied to restore businesses and communities and homes must be spent to rebuild at the current location. That's a stress point. That's a stress point because we know that rebuilding in the current location in many cases is not a good idea. It continues to put persons and property in harm's way. It is inefficient, it costs money, and it's dangerous. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, we've already seen people complaining about this. The governor of New Jersey, the governor of New York have argued with FEMA that they could have some interpretation or some way to actually not require it rebuilding in the same place. Georgetown Climate Centers reviewed this legislation. I looked at it. I agree that probably the Stafford Act is more flexible than people are giving credit for in this regard. But the people who administer the Stafford Act don't think it is. And so you've hit the wall. So let's look at the original goals. What were the prior goals? Well, the prior goals in the Stafford Act are assistance, efficiency, conservation, and this one over here that I think it's important for us to consider, avoiding fraud. The primary reason that they required rebuilding in the same place was to avoid fraudulent claims for people that wanted to make and move and do other things. And I don't just mean individual people, I mean entire state governments, like say the state of Mississippi and Haley Barbour, who wanted to take low-income housing and build a new port for Biloxi. There were reasons, and there are still good reasons, that they have that design. The problem is, it no longer works. So it can't be met under the current law. So we have to think about these things and look at them again. And believe it or not, in our dysfunctional Congress right now, they're actually grappling with this. They know it's not working. And both parties have something that they want to get at. Republicans are like, we don't want waste and abuse, and we don't want to give people money anyway. And the Democrats are like, oh, we still have to help people, and we want, climate change is happening, so we have to do something. And so in a very indirect, kind of struggling way, because they haven't taken me on as their advisor, they're getting to the same point that I want them to get to. And right now, you know what? That's okay. And the Obama administration kind of has done the same thing. We've got an interagency climate change adaptation task force. They're kind of looking at this in this way, kind of, but not so much. And I worry that they're all just going to end up in the resiliency adaptive management pile, and nobody's going to think about it or what's going to happen or look at it in the long term. And that's why I think this is important, and I want to make this be there. I told the Presidential Personnel Office that they need a climate change adaptation czar in the Council on Environmental Quality in the White House that looks at climate change adaptation this way. They haven't accepted my proposal yet, but perhaps they will. That's all I have with this. I want to leave time for questions. So, I'll give it to you. Yes?
So the obvious question is, assuming you do this analysis and you end up with can't be met under the current law, must be changed. To somebody who is, a federal administrator, that is, them's fighting words, because I know I can't get anything changed right now, and so I've got to find a way to essentially interpret my way out of these problems. What do we do with the fact that, that the political consensus in this country doesn't exist around that there's a climate change that we need to adapt towards, so that, I don't want to over-describe it because, after Hurricane Sandy, they're actually, FEMA has been trying to adjust how it amends the Stafford Act, and EPA is like funding, sewage treatment plants to basically build outside the floodplains where they hadn't before. But inaction in Congress is a reality, right?
It is, and this is, and don't think I'm living in, the land of Maryland of Oz. I know that this is not workable, and yet I think that this provides a focus that brings up responsibility, and that at least identifies to the public, if they choose to be involved, what's at stake. So both of your examples are so interesting. EPA is acting under its existing authority, right, to provide ways for sewage treatment plants to not be damaged. But that's the original goal, right? The original goal is to have these things that don't go offline and don't not work, et cetera, et cetera.
And in fairness, the Sandy supplemental appropriation created some additional authority there. So there was actually a moment where you got Congress to sort of figure out.
There you go. Although I would argue that you could have done a lot of that under existing authority. And also, Sandy showed that EPA really needs to figure out which environmental laws can be waived at what time. I mean, I don't know if all of you after Sandy listening, NPR people like, yeah, we got the subways cleared. Where'd the water go? I don't know. It went out without treatment, right? I mean, there are all these things that it brings up that don't work. But then getting to the other issue about what can we have Congress do and they don't even believe in this, they may not do anything. But to me, if everybody systemically looked at this, if an agency said, we can't do this because the world is now different, this is my report to you, Congress. Yeah, Congress, if it's controlled by a certain party, may just cut your funding. But at least it's there. New York Times will write an article about it. Somebody will know. And instead of Congress doing some weird slap-happy agricultural food stamp thing that might have an impact on climate change, but really does a lot of other things that may or may not be that good, and nobody's really focused on what's happening, you at least focus the issue. And that, to me, gives us the participatory responsibility that I'm looking for. And I know that's kind of a dream in the sky, but that's the best I can do. Yes?
I want to go back to your point about who pays, and that leads to the question of who's responsible. My sense is that the way in which you answer that question dictates to a very large degree how much money you're going to spend. I'll give you my personal example. When Irene struck in Stratford, Vermont, there are all sorts of emergency responses required. And basically, in our community, that consists of people going out, helping neighbors, going out with tractors and front loaders, not always in a way that was perfect from an environmental sustainability standpoint, but accomplished most of the necessary disaster response incredibly quickly and incredibly cheap. Let's take Kivalina in Alaska, a very vulnerable village. The estimates I've seen are that it would cost somewhere between $50 and $100 million to move. I'm sure if the Army Corps of Engineers got an appropriation, hired 17 consultants, and did the work, it would cost that. I suspect, having seen the pictures of the village, that if the community just sort of picked itself up and moved 5 miles, they could get accomplished for $750,000 or maybe $3 million. And I think there are a lot of examples, and at the international stage,
Absolutely.
If some of the disappearing nation states are looking to an international fund to deal with climate adaptation challenges, and we got some World Bank consultants to figure out how much it would cost, it would be unbelievably expensive. On the other hand, if the responsibility, fair or unfair, fell on the islanders to do it, they would find the least cost solution, and that would be dramatically lower cost. So I don't know what to do. I think I'm right in those observations. I don't know what to do with that.
I think you are right. And in fact, because of some work I've done in Alaska, you're so right about Kivalina, partly because most of the native village housing is built through an Army subsidy, which requires it to be standardized through all the 50 states. So like a shack costs $300,000. It's just obscene, but they've done that in Alaska because that's the only way they ever got money. And you're right about internationally, the same thing has occurred, and that is why it first brought up in Copenhagen that rather than using funding from, say, an international carbon trading system to fund adaptation by giving grants directly to countries and the IMF and World Bank, that they create some technocratic organization that figures out the best and most efficient way to do it. And of course, countries are like, well, that's our sovereignty, why are you doing that? You know, but it's exactly the question you're asking. And my only response to that is, that's why I say you have to look at efficiency as well as the responsibility in doing that. Because with international fund, it's in Alaska, it's exactly the same way. You've got limited funds. You have a lot of people that need to be moved. You have a lot of impacts. So, you know, I think you can disentangle those questions, but I agree that it is something that has occurred repeatedly. Yes?
So playing on that theme, what we're talking about is how do you liberate native wit? How do you make it and take it away from being this very, very much of a bummer thing and turn it into a game that is fun because we win? You know, it's to me, I'm tired of hearing about, you know, the disaster looming. There's always disaster looming. I'm curious to know how we're going to win. And so, you know, regulation isn't going to win. In fact, planning isn't even going to win because we're notorious. You look in the back of the Scientific American every month, and they always tell you, you know, it's delightful. You watch the projections of the geniuses from 50 and 100 years ago. How do we learn that we're lousy at this and just allow ourselves to just make more experiments and be able to, you know, there's got to be a way to make a contest out of this where we get best practices and we win, and as John says, figured out how to do a 100 million job for $750,000. I mean,
well, if you look at dynamism and complexity, I think that it gets a little bit to what you're talking about. I mean, the only real solution is human ingenuity.
Yeah.
Whether that's human ingenuity through controlling climate change or human ingenuity through adaptation or whatever, that is the solution. And if you put a lot of humanity in a dependent position where they are not allowed or they are told explicitly not to do anything, then that is a problem. And we
I'm not
interfere with
suggesting that. I'm not
No,
suggesting they wait for...
I'm saying, I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with you. So what I'm saying is that this goes back to participatory and bottom up. And we have examples internationally of if you go to the country, if you go to the small location and let them figure out how to best solve the problem, you do tend to do it more efficiently, primarily because they understand the location better and they understand their needs better. The only thing you have to watch out for there is that they're not causing a negative impact on somebody else.
Yep.
And I'm not proposing, this is not to propose uber regulation or uber planning.
It scarily comes down that way. It comes
comes
down
down-
as exactly what you're arguing against, which is, you know,
What I'm trying to say
silverback
is-
white guy telling the world what's going to happen.
Just be aware, and don't just let random people make a choice that affect other people
Okay.
without their participation. Yes.
I think a lot of the comments so far have touched on an issue that I think about long-term adaptation versus crisis response.
Right.
Because a lot of what we're talking about, you know, in terms of responsibility, rising sea level in, say, Tuvalu, that's a crisis. And Tuvalu shouldn't have to pay to basically move their entire population. They can't pay. The choice is either someone else pays, the person who's actually responsible pays, the country does, or the whole country carries. So that, I mean, that's one situation. Another situation is sort of this more forward-looking, what Pat's talking about, forward-looking, planning, incentivizing. Yes, in that case, you can take advantage of efficiencies, and the responsibility, that balance between responsibility and efficiency shifts quite a bit. Maybe not for the top-level decision makers, but definitely at the ground level, and the mid-level of government, that you know you have a little bit more room to play. So really looking at the response time and the time frame makes a huge difference and as in the legal framework and the regulatory framework, but also just in terms of moving people and resources around on the ground.
I think that's a very fair thing to note. I mean, adaptation is on a scale. It's on a very big scale from more immediate to something longer term, and our laws are also designed for immediate response versus longer term response. And those things can be changed in their appropriate sphere, I think, or examined in an appropriate sphere. I think you may be the last question. Let's not go about it.
Well, I have to say, I'm Keevalino. I mean, with all due respect, my dear colleague. I studied that pretty carefully, and it's not a matter of backing up to U-Haul, okay?
Right.
You're talking about a subsistence culture that's existed for 10,000 years on these barrier islands. Shishmaref is the same, the other 100 are the same. They've been studying alternatives now for 3 years, okay? There's nothing that's coming in under 200 million. There's no communities on land that want them. You're not talking about moving entire intact families and communities and healthcare and education the way they want to do it. You're not talking about that. So let's drop this notion of adaptation. You're talking about destroying their culture, okay? So take it on board, because that's what we're being faced with. One last thing about adaptation. I think it's a real dangerous thing. What I'm seeing is shift to focus on adaptation. And the working title of the paper that I'm working on right now is Cities on Stilts, the Myth of Adaptation. We're on a 4-degree, you know this.
Yeah.
We're on a 4-degree Celsius trajectory. There is almost no chance we can hold temperatures below 2. That's off the table. We're fighting for maybe 3, probably 4. All of the literature, all of the scientific literature on as best as people can imagine, and it's almost impossible to imagine a world of 4C. The World Bank, the Royal Society, the National Academy of Sciences are all saying the civilization as we know it in major sections of the world will not be possible at 4C. So I'm glad you're doing this, Victor, and as usual, you bring the sweet voice of reason to everything that you do. But if we don't take on board the trajectory that we have positioned this globe, and if we shift one iota of focus from mitigation to adaptation at the expense of mitigation, it is a fatal mistake for human civilization.
Well, I will respond to that by saying I'm as concerned about what's happening in the mitigation area as you are. And this is in no way meant to deflect attention from that. And I just think we have to do that too. I just think we have to do both. And I'll just end in response to your point about the natives and their society and their culture and everything. That's also partly what we mean when we talk about efficiency and values. Like, what are we trying to replicate, and who's responsible? And is it fair to destroy a whole society that has lived a particular way and that wants to live a particular way? And I don't mean to suggest humans don't evolve and change. They do. We all do. But that is a value that has to be taken into account as well. We do face a huge crisis with climate change, and I think we don't know how awful and where awful. And the more information we learn about how awful and where awful, we have to do the best we can. In addition to controlling those harms. I thank you all for your time and for coming, and let's talk to you.